All right, bruvs. Before we were unceremoniously tripped up of our fucking stream, we're back. I'll wait a minute just so I can catch up if it hasn't already. I want this to shut down again. Make sure we're back up and working. Drama life. Hell is this? All right, let me put this on. There's no way that was 24 minutes, or was it? How many pages did we go? Just fucking 5. There's no way that was 24 minutes. All right. Two episodes in Lawrence's life have been described as exerting a profound influence upon his character and personality. His psychosexual life. These were his love for the donkey boy Dahum at the excavations at Karchemish in 1912 and his terrible experiences at Dara in 1917. The first of these, Dahum, is believed to have inclined Lawrence to homosexuality, but more important, to his lifelong devotion to the Arab cause. The second, whatever really happened at Dara, has been blamed for his masochism, which it was recently revealed became unusually extreme towards the end of his life. Aldington wrote about Dahum as follows: probably the great love of his life was the donkey boy or water boy, Dahum, also known as Sheikh Ahmed. He was called Dahum, the dark one, because he was very fair. It is said that Dahum was mysterious essay to whose memory the dedicatory poem of 7 Pillars was addressed. Sir Leonard Woolley wrote that Dahum, a boy of about 15, was remarkably handsome and with a body of perfect proportions. Lawrence used him as a model for a crouching nude figure, which proved to the Arabs that Lawrence was a pederast, a view widely held by them. Simpson and Knightley, whose researches are mentioned later, believe that Dahum's importance in Lawrence's life cannot be overstated, but that it was not a sensuous one. Colonel Barrard Villars called it a very tender friendship. Lawrence himself, in a letter, described how he and Dahum shared a sleeping bag, curled up in a. They bathed together, playing like puppies in the water. Lawrence took Dahum home to Oxford, where he created quite a stir, to Lawrence's evident pleasure. Lawrence's openly avowed love for Dahum, the Arab view of their relationship, and the statement by a close friend, Vivian Richards, that Lawrence showed a like affection for other youths too, both in Arabia and after his return to England, have naturally convinced many writers that the friendship had marked homosexual overtones. Its real importance, however, was that Lawrence's love for the Arab cause grew out of his love for Dahum. Dahum, bruv. Lawrence declared this quite openly in statements to friends. Is this light even on? Yeah, it must be. Or is it? Yeah, it's on. Lawrence. I don't even know where the hell I'm at now. Lawrence declared this quite openly in statements to friends and in the dedication to 7 Pillars of Wisdom. If one accepts as inevitable that Dahum was S.A., Lawrence's experiences at Dara have been the subject of much speculation, partly because he told such conflicting stories about what happened there. According to one estimate, he gave 9 different versions. He had been captured in disguise and, if identified, could have been shot as a spy. The Turkish commandment, a pederast, why do they call him commandments? Commandant. A pederast sent for Lawrence for carnal purposes, taking him for a young Circassian. Lawrence was flogged, possibly for refusing the Bey's advances, and was later released, having submitted to sodomy. Jesus Christ. Peter Brent, who suggests that the name which Lawrence took to conceal his identity, Aman Ibn Bagher, may have been a bitter joke, concludes. So, beaten, scared, bleeding, and buggered, Lawrence made his painful escape. The lecherous Bey, it seems, was in fact hilariously heterosexual, possibly bisexual, and it was certainly to his soldiers that Lawrence yielded his bodily integrity. As he later confessed to Charlotte Shaw, the Turkish Bey hushed up the affair when he discovered that Lawrence had been, in fact, an important prisoner. But Lawrence would never hush it up, although he admitted that he had been very reluctant to include an amount of Dara in 7 Pillars of Wisdom. He was obviously obsessed by the agonizing memory and unable to stop speaking and writing about what he had suffered. He wrote that during the beating, he had felt that a delicious warmth, probably sexual, was swelling through me. These words have led to speculation that it was at Dara that the seeds of his masochism were planted. This seems improbable. His lurid and painfully detailed accounts of the flogging sound very like the fantasy of a confirmed masochist. How, for example, could he have known exactly what the marks on his skin looked like, the changes in color as lash followed lash, unless he had eyes in the back of his head? It may be observed in passing that sadomasochists with an interest in flagellation often admit to being stimulated by the sight of changes in color of the skin during and after beatings. Certainly, Dara was a turning point in Lawrence's life. It seems that subsequently he yielded more readily to sadistic impulses, partly perhaps in a desire for revenge. But the most painful result was that feelings of guilt and defilement led him to self-abasement. Ultimately, he felt compelled to refuse offers of high appointments and enlisted in the RAF, which Aldington called willful courting of plebeian degradation. Lawrence himself wrote to Lionel Curtis in 1923, "Self-degradation is my aim." Letters, page 411. Lawrence was 24 when he fell in love with Dahum and 29 when he was flogged at Dara. I am sure that we should look further back for the origins of his homosexuality and his sadomasochism. I have said that Lawrence shared with Napoleon some sexual inclinations, and curiously enough, these can possibly be ascribed to similar family backgrounds: a gentle father, unable to punish his sons, and a stern mother who could and did. Lawrence's mother frequently beat his bare bottom, most severely on one occasion when he had nearly been expelled from school. After being caught engaged in mutual masturbation, Jesus Christ, who does that at school? Although Ned, as he was called in the family, was the most stubborn of her 5 sons, the beatings perhaps helped to assuage the nagging of her ultra-Puritan conscience, which never let her forget that the boys had been conceived in sin. Sarah Lawrence, herself an illegitimate child, had been a maid in the house of Sir Thomas Chapman, a baronet who eloped with her but could never obtain a divorce. Ned was plainly the son, perhaps the only one, to whom she transmitted her guilty conscience. Unfairly, of course, but none the less torturing. On the whole, Ned had a happy childhood. It has been called a protected life, and he never went to a boarding school. But as he grew older, he felt the need to escape from the atmosphere of sin and guilt. in a home in which his fanatically religious mother ruled her sons and their alcoholic father. He took to living in a small hut in the garden, and finally ran off and enlisted in the Royal Artillery. He was underage, undersized, and limped slightly from a badly united fracture of an ankle. The first experience of barrack room life was not a happy one, and it lasted only for 8 months until his father purchased his discharge. Before this, he had been upset when he witnessed the savage beating of a soldier who had stolen money from a comrade, an unpardonable crime in the barrack room. At Oxford, Lawrence became something of a daredevil and a pioneer of roof climbing. Sarah Lawrence was a powerful factor in her second son's psychosexual development. There was not much affection between mother and son, and if this again recalls Napoleon, I think that Letizia Bonaparte was a better mother than Sarah Lawrence. Sarah Lawrence described his curious relationship with his mother in letters to Charlotte Shaw, whom he adopted as a substitute mother, incidentally assuming her surname as at his enlistments. One sentence with the special bearing on his homosexuality was, "Knowledge of her will prevent my ever making any woman a mother and the cause of children." Dr. Jeffrey Myers, who in his book The Wounded Spirit analyzes, or is that analysis? Is that analyzes? Analyzes Lawrence's writings and his character, writes, that's got to be analysis. The Wounded Spirit analyses Lawrence's writings and his character, writes, Charlotte Shaw, who shared Lawrence's idea of sexlessness and inviolate virginity, never slept with her husband, Bernard Shaw. Like Charles Gard, Jesus Christ, like Charles Gordon, Lawrence abhorred the flesh. He gloried in his virginity and rejection of the dirty business of sexual relations. Several friends testified to this. Some of Napoleon's friends, such as Claire de Remusat, chapter 5, page 87, believed him to be incapable of loving any woman. Did not leave it to women to make such allegations about him. He himself made this sad flaw in his nature abundantly clear in his own writings, such as 7 Pillars of Wisdom, The Mint, and his poetry, published as minorities, which breathed self-condemnation. In 1935, he wrote to Lady Astor that his heart never cared for anyone, though much for places and things. He once wrote, "Bother all women. They seem to upset people I like," and he often expressed positive detestation of women, especially of physical relations with them. I believe that to the influence of his relations with his mother was added the still more potent factor of organ inferiority, which I believe operated also in Napoleon's case. Chapter 5, page 104. Lawrence was a small man, and Aldington described his arrested development as being both mental and physical. The Turk at Dara, it has been suggested, may have been attracted because Lawrence's curious arrested development made him look much younger than he was. Someone said that in his white robes he looked like a choir boy. To the end, he hardly looked his age. Robert Graves wrote about Lawrence's bright blue eyes, but added that they never met the eyes of the person whom he was addressing, but seemed to be making an inventory of clothes and limbs. Henry Williamson, who thought his face and head looked like Wagner's, also commented on his difficulty in looking people in the eye. This suggests not so much immaturity as a lack of self-confidence. Wavell wrote of Lawrence's curse of self-consciousness, and Eric Kensington frequently referred to his self-conscious giggle. Lawrence often used schoolboyish expressions in his letters, according to Ralph Isham, one of the contributors to T.E. Lawrence by his friends. He recognized his immaturity and worried about it. He resented his body's permanent immaturity. He did not, I think, realize that his personality also would not quite grow up. His hatred of his body was a boy's hatred. His fear of women was a boy's fear. His terror of being noticed was a boy's terror. He liked pranks and stories, as a boy does. I mean, I don't think he looks young. I mean, he looks fucking old as hell right there. I don't know how old he was there, but I mean, he doesn't look young. This strikes me as one of the most valuable and percipient of the contributions to the symposium by people who knew Lawrence well. Immaturity, even a fear of growing up, is a frequent concomitant of the homosexual life. And later in this chapter will be found further pointers to the bearing of such emotions on Lawrence's mind. His stunted growth has been attributed to the badly united fracture of an ankle at the age of 16, and also to an attack of mumps, causing damage to one or both testicles, as that disease often does. An atrophied testicle would have been likely to affect his emotional more than his physical development. Such a disability as height, and even possibly the limp, could have contributed to organ inferiority. With the various consequences which I have already described, homosexuality being often partly an indication of immaturity, Aldington may have been right in thinking that Lawrence's mental, as well as his physical development, was in some way arrested, despite his intellectual attainments and the political motives underlying some of his actions. These were sometimes ill conceived, but hardly immature. They were directed to a cause in which he and others passionately believed. The ascendancy of the Arabs. Clearly, we cannot label as a little man that Lawrence, who could impose himself upon a proud people as a leader, though the extent to which he really was their leader rather than a kind of mascot and provider of money may be a bit doubtful. He impressed such men as Winston Churchill, Basil Liddell Hart, Robert Graves, John Buchan, Lord Trenchard, and though to a lesser extent Wavell. These men may have been swayed by Lawrence's own stories about his exploits with the Arabs, though he certainly proved himself to be both tough and brave. As an educated man, he could be, and was, his own propagandist. The Arabs with whom he campaigned were uneducated, and their stories could not be checked against Lawrence's boastful accounts of his experiences. The balance was to some extent redressed by the publication in 1966 of T. E. Lawrence, An Arab View by Suleiman Musa. He goes further than Aldington in his total disbelief of many of Lawrence's stories. In fact, he did not even believe the story of Dara, which often writers have all accepted despite the many different versions told by Lawrence. Perhaps, like me, he detected that faint but persistent note of fantasy. Mr. Musa thought that Lawrence decided not to publish some of his tales because they could have been denounced as untrue by some of the people involved in them. The mystery of Lawrence stemmed from his own lies, because Lawrence knew deep in his heart that the greater part of his fame was based on fraud. He accepted the humiliation of his experiences in the ranks as a form of penance. Suleiman Musa made a good case for these beliefs and for his conclusion that Lawrence's reputation was created by the fraud and exaggeration perpetuated by his able pen, the process being completed by the journalistic skill of the shrewd Lowell Thomas in pursuance of his mandate to build up a British war hero. The British public were delighted to have a congenial subject to offset the squalid misery of the Western Front. But although Suleiman Musa insisted that Lawrence's leadership was not what the public believed it to be, he gave him credit for his wisdom and judgment in selecting good Arab leaders and ensuring that they were encouraged and helped by British gold. Lawrence's knowledge of Arabic was by no means perfect. To the Arabs, he was an unusual type of Englishman with whom they were ready to cooperate. If Mr. Musa portrays Lawrence as more of a mascot than a leader, It is understandable that an Arab should seek to give full credit to the fine Arab warriors for whom Lawrence himself expressed love and admiration. His influence over them was helped by his single minded dedication to securing a bright future for the Arab people, his love for individual Arabs, and a certain genius for friendship which he plainly possessed. Many fine people valued Lawrence's friendship. One of his friends, Vivian Richards, spoke of his grace of personal friendship. Henry Williamson, the novelist, entitled his book about Lawrence's genius of friendship. I was interested to learn that a former acquaintance for whom I had both liking and respect had said that he was deeply attracted to Lawrence physically. This honest witness was Dr. Ernest Al-Tunyan of Aleppo, who had won a military cross in the First World War and had soon established his own family life on normal lines. His testimony confirms Lawrence's attractiveness to young men. Dr. Al-Tunyan was one of many who recognized Lawrence's self-confessed longing to be liked, though he recorded him as saying, "I have never loved anyone." Napoleon is on record as having made the same confession. E.M. Forster was passionately fond of Lawrence. They corresponded and discussed each other's homosexual writings. Forster was not furtive when dealing with known homosexual writers. He was particularly proud of his own daring novel about homosexual love called Maurice. How many pages do I gotta go here? Quite a bit. 152, so 8 more pages. The taboo of his day led him to decide that it must be published after his death. It proved to be a terribly dull and surprisingly badly written book, which seems to display a kind of social naivety and a curious ignorance of how normal people behave. When news of Lawrence's death reached him, Forster was on the point of setting out to stay with him at his cottage, Clouds Hill. Lawrence, in his invitation, had written, "There are no beds but 2 sleeping bags embroidered meum and tuum." Lawrence's friends were almost exclusively male. His women friends were married and hence, as it were, safe, even as in the case of Mrs. Bernard Shaw, maternal. The wife of one of his commanding officers in the RAF wrote a book about him, which she called The Golden Reign, which was his own term for this period in the RAF. Mrs. Smith's book reveals his capacity for friendship, especially with children. Like General Gordon, Lawrence in early life cultivated the society of Sunday school boys. I wonder why. And he was an officer in the Church Lads Brigade. Describing Lawrence's friendships with homosexual individuals, Dr. Jeffrey Myers goes on, and with young airmen like the beautiful blonde and blue-eyed R.A. Guy, whom he called Rabbit or Poppet, and to whom he writes, "My pleasure in the RAF was partly largely due to the pleasure I got from your blue and yellow self, and I owe you a deep debt for many happy times." Lawrence's best friend in the Arab army was Ali ibn al-Hussein, according to Robert Graves and Vivian Richards, who compared these two to David and Jonathan. In fact, Lawrence himself made the same comparison. Writing about an occasion when they exchanged clothing, he said, "We kissed like David and Jonathan, each wearing the other's clothes." Vivian Richards went on, "In the Tank Corps and the RAF, he was drawn to English youngsters, one here and there, but he seemed to like them in the mass also. The vitality of their ingenuous youth was food and drink to him." This is not quite the impression conveyed by Lawrence himself. The Mint, which describes his life in the ranks, is hardly a good food guide. The French Colonel Barrade Villars wrote that it reveals the anguish of an unbalanced mind. R. Payne asserted that, far from resenting the imputations of homosexuality, he was amused by them because he had no passionate objection to homosexuality. All too obviously, he had none. In Seven Pillars of Wisdom, he dwelled upon the attractiveness of various Arab youths, including a promiscuously homosexual pair, Daud and Faraj, whom he took on as his servants because they looked so young and clean. They were strongly attracted by Lawrence, and as they begged him to employ them, he observed of Daud all the woman in him evident in his longing. Lawrence mocked old Auda for his passion for his young wife, and wrote that clean homosexual love was better than sordid affairs with women. Our youths began to slake one another's few needs in their own clean bodies, which seemed sinless and even pure, friends quivering together in the yielding sand with intimate hot limbs in supreme embrace. Surely few would assert that Aldington was biased when he commented on that as follows: "You would go a long way before finding in other respectable writers so outspoken a declaration of preferences for homosexuality. That Lawrence should write with approval of flagrant acts of sodomy does not make a case for suggesting that he indulged in it himself. He wrote to E.M. Forster, "The impulse strong enough to make me touch another creature has not yet been born in me." I would be inclined to take that at its face value, despite Lawrence's habit of writing what he hoped would be believed. However, the strong homosexual component in his nature could well have allowed him to witness such conduct with approval rather than with disgust. I think that we can agree that Simpson and Knightley were right to assert that Lawrence's distaste for physical homosexual relations, at least in his own case, was genuine. When he snuggled so intimately with Dahum in a sleeping bag, it was only because of the cold. Graves and other personal friends said that he had a horror of being touched. This seems to be consistent with his whole character and supports the belief that he did not himself indulge in any physical manifestations of homosexuality. It was probably this belief which led some of his relations and friends to declare he was not homosexual. Whatever happened at Dara, it was hardly fair of one of Lawrence's detractors, Malcolm Muggeridge, to refer to him as the sodomite saint, however tempting that trite description must have seemed to one who pontificates so loquaciously. Loquacious. But the point is really unimportant compared with the impact of his homosexuality upon his life. And there were other distressing tendencies which must have greatly intensified the feelings of guilt resulting from his fall from grace at Dara. Sadomasochism, a powerful current in his life, is a deviation which is often, though not specifically, associated with homosexuality, and indeed with any failure to achieve smooth adaptation to normal sexuality. It was, as we shall see, the masochism which predominated in his case, but he also showed some evidence of sadistic tendencies. He was harsh and often resorted to flogging in dealing with offenders. This the Arabs seem to have expected and accepted, but a streak of cruelty, even described as savagery, was noticeable to some of his associates. It is indeed discernible in his writings, for example, in a description of the summary execution of one of his followers, which he carried out himself in order to prevent the development of a damaging blood feud. He showed callous disregard for other people's feelings. Some of the anecdotes about himself, which he loved to retell with glee and which he told to his biographers, make him sound like a thoroughly unpleasant little man. "I was very spiny and high," he said of himself, and he got quite a kick out of discountenancing young army officers and others who failed to recognize the great Lawrence of Arabia. Dr. Myers finds that his megalomania, taste for exotic dress, and desire for fame are not attractive characteristics. They are fairly typical of the aggression of a small man burdened by inner sources of deep disquiet. But it was his masochism which soured his life. And, whilst it is just possible that the brutal treatment at Dara implanted such feelings in his troubled mind, it is also possible that, because of such feelings, the flogging may not have been so traumatic as it would have been to a more well balanced individual. Read again his account in Seven Pillars of Wisdom with an ear tuned to detect the notes of fantasy, and in the light of the later revelations to which we must now turn. If Richard Aldington had lived to read the remarkable disclosures by Colin Simpson and Philip Knightley in the Sunday Times Review in June 1968, these would have abundantly confirmed his opinion that there was something very odd about T.E. Lawrence. Even Aldington might have been left speechless. The painful and distasteful facts must be stated to complete the picture. One of the participants with Lawrence in some strange masochistic practices have decided to make his experiences public. The Bodleian Library agreed in order that a balanced picture might be presented to give limited access to papers which they had not intended to release for many years. Simpson and Knightley were allowed to make use of these. A Scotsman named John Bruce had approached the Sunday Times with a strange story which he had promised Mrs. Bernard Shaw that he would not tell until after the death of Lawrence's mother. Bruce was first interviewed by Lord Rennell of Rod, and his story was confirmed by other men whom Lawrence had involved in some very curious practices. The articles retold the story of Lawrence's enlistments in the RAF and the Army. When he joined the Royal Tank Corps, John Bruce, at that time employed by Lawrence, also joined up and became, in effect, a kind of bodyguard to Lawrence. He once got into trouble for fighting a soldier who had abused Lawrence. Eventually, Lawrence told Bruce a fantastic story about a mythical relative, whom he called the Old Man, on whom he was financially dependent, not despondent. The Old Man was said to keep an eye on Lawrence's conduct, and when it did not satisfy him, he ordained punishment. Birches were sent to nearby railway stations where Bruce had to collect them in order to administer corporal punishment, whilst Lawrence lay down with the parts not destined for birching well covered. At first, Bruce refused to play his part in this strange ritual, but he was ultimately persuaded to yield. He was perhaps somewhat innocent, but he was only 19 and had great respect for Lawrence. On one occasion, the beating was ruled by the old man to have been too soft. Lawrence pretended that he had gone off to report to him, and came back saying that the birching must be given with his trousers down. Bruce was ordered to give him a second dose, after which Lawrence said, "Better give me another one for luck." This time Lawrence returned from seeing his imaginary relative, giving the thumbs up sign. Young though he was, John Bruce had natural misgivings about taking part in these strange performances, though he never seemed to question the methods by which Lawrence received the orders of his powerful relative, nor how the old man came to hear of Lawrence's misdeeds, which were often of a trivial and ridiculous nature, like missing a church parade. During the next 12 years, these birchings continued, often on the anniversary of Lawrence's flogging at Dara, and were administered by various young men who corroborated Bruce's story. Lord Trenchard was among those who knew about mysterious marks which were seen on Lawrence's back from time to time. Bruce was required to write reports about Lawrence's demeanor and behavior under punishment. At one time, Lawrence took a cottage at Cruden Bay for a period of leave with Bruce. Birch's arrival at the village shop. Birches arrived at the village shop. To Simpson and Knightley, all this was a brutal therapy he adopted to expunge the memory of Dara. We may, however, wonder if anyone but a committed masochist would have invented so elaborate a therapy. Personally, I agree with Christopher Sykes, who compared Lawrence to that pathetic masochist, the poet Algernon Swinburne, and thought that it was a routine hardly credible to be organized in an asexual spirit, as if it were necessary to emphasize the sexual element in these proceedings. J.E. Mack asserts that he required that the beatings be severe enough to produce a seminal emission. If these ritual flagellations were indeed related to Dara, their object was almost certainly not penance for what happened there, nor a desire to expunge the memory, but rather a desire to experience again that delicious warmth, probably sexual, which he had felt swelling through him during that brutal ordeal. His situation at Dara was far removed from a spanking across his mother's knee, but the delicious warmth probably owed at least part of its origin to a deep desire to be still a child. This is characteristic of some homosexual men. They dread growing up and taking their place in the adult heterosexual world with all its challenges. I'm sure that will make a lot of fans of the LGBT world. A suggested feature in those ridiculous letters which Lawrence concocted in order to hoodwink young Bruce into beating him is the way in which the fictitious old man is made to refer to Lawrence as the lad, a grown lad, when he was, of course, in his middle 30s. For John Bruce, the affair ended when, somewhat puzzled, he was discharged from the Royal Tank Corps without being given any reason. When he asked for one, all that an officer would say was, "Why don't you ask the Arab?" In a letter to Lionel Curtis, Lawrence wrote, "My masochism remains and will remain only moral." Letters, page 414. Whatever he may have thought about his masochism, one might imagine that all the subterfuge involved in engaging young Bruce as a kind of slave, spinning to him and to other young men his complex fantasies and acting out these fantasies to give verisimilitude to the stories designed to satisfy his craving for the physical pain, must have involved feelings of shame and humiliation. Perhaps he thus assuaged what he pleased to call his moral masochism, if it was his oft expressed desire for self abasement which led him to enlist, and apparently to seek anonymity. This was only partly successful. The kindly tolerant British other rank, though occasionally driven as most animals and even birds are driven to persecute an unusual creature, discerned in this quiet, pleasant scholar a quality deserving of respect. Eager though he was to be considered a great writer, in his self abasement he even derided his masterpiece, Seven Pillars of Wisdom, saying that it contained enough piffle and romance and woolliness to make a realist sick. Here he was, it seems, admitting his habit of romanticizing and embroidering the story of his life. Seven Pillars is certainly a remarkable essay in self revelation. Competent judges have deemed it to be a literary masterpiece, but it seems to me that by following it up with such works as The Mint and a paper describing the squalor of a voyage to India in a troop ship, Lawrence did more to besmirch his literary reputation than he did by confessing to inaccuracies and exaggerations. Some of the revolting passages are so nauseating as to seem to defile the pages. Like Gordon, Lawrence experienced death wishes, and it is not surprising that in his moods of self degradation, disillusionment, and depression, he sometimes contemplated suicide. His discharge from the RAF left him numb, feeling that he was finished and wishing that my own curtain would fall, as he wrote to Peter Davies, one of Sir James Barrie's adopted sons. John Bruce said that on one occasion at Clouds Hill, he had prevented Lawrence from committing suicide. In a mood of deep depression, he confiscated Lawrence's revolver and ammunition. Lawrence wrote to Lionel Curtis, "I pull out my motorbike and hurl it top speed through these unfit roads for hour after hour. Then, this, he said, was to settle his disturbed mind when sometimes I wonder how far mad I am." Letters, page 416. This cry from the heart of a lonely man of undoubted intellect and so much capacity for friendship and for sharing his feelings is particularly pathetic today because of the greatly enlarged knowledge about such personal problems, not only among doctors but among the general public. If Lawrence, the author of a widely acclaimed book and of several learned treatises, could have read two short books intended for the general reader, Dr. D.J. West's Homosexuality and Sexual Deviation by Dr. Anthony Storr, how completely different his life might have been. He would have learned, oh my God, he would have learned that not only homosexuality, but in Dr. Storr's words, all sexual deviations are forms of immaturity, childish attitudes which have not been outgrown. We have seen that Lawrence recognized and resented his own immaturity. To have come to terms with it, possibly with the help of a psychotherapist, could have enabled him to outgrow it and perhaps to sublimate it more effectively than he was able to achieve on his own, though that was no small achievement. It is truly amazing that a man with his handicaps could have made such an undying mark on generations of his fellow countrymen, their allies and their enemies, and enabled his family and many friends and admirers to see him as their hero he longed to be. Where the hell am I? Even as one of the greatest men of his time. Of all the prominent men studied in this book, he is perhaps the one who most compels in our Jesus Christ. Of all the prominent men studied in this book, he is perhaps the one who most compels our sympathy, possibly because so much has come to be known about his personal problems. He clearly had so much to offer that one can only deeply regret that his homosexual inclinations, repressed or not, almost inevitably meant unhappiness in his day. Nowadays, the outspoken, even noisy protagonist of what they are pleased to call the gay life may try by their protestations and reassurances convince themselves that they are happy, but I wonder how truly this represents their inmost feelings. Experience with patients, admittedly not at all a representative cross section of the populace, convinces me that many of them would gladly exchange their mode of life for one of fulfillment of the biological purpose of our life here on Earth, rearing a family. When Lawrence was back in the RAF after a spell in the Army at Bovington, which he disliked, he wrote to the Honorable Rennell Rod, "Mark me down for a further spell of quite happy existence. This is an odd change." For I had made up my mind in Bovington to come to a natural end about Christmas, when the reprint of my book would have been finished. Perhaps he only meant that the book would have given him something to live for, or even to live on. Whether or not Lawrence's love of speed and headlong dashes on his fast bro superior were directed by a conscious or unconscious wish for death, it is pleasant to think that they conspired to end his life in a manner containing a touch of heroic self sacrifice. Coming at speed over a blind rise on a country road, he swerved to avoid two boys on bicycles, fell with his motorcycle, and sustained irreversible brain damage. How far such split second decisions are deliberate is hard to guess, but in losing his life while saving those of the two boys, he achieved a modestly heroic death, which enables us to leave him on a pleasing note. At Lawrence's funeral, we learn from Christopher Sykes' biography of Lady Astor, Sir Basil Liddell Hart was a chief mourner, and Lady Astor and Winston Churchill mingled their tears, which neither tried to conceal. Lady Astor, always a loyal friend, took a leading part among those who tried to prevent the publication of Aldington's book, and she always refused to accept the hateful facts. John Nicholson and T.E. Lawrence were homosexuals well to the right of center on the Kinsey scale. In Nicholson's case, such tendencies were severely repressed, not perhaps so much so in the case of Lawrence. To their homosexuality was added sadomasochism, as is often the case. In Nicholson, sadistic tendencies predominated. With Lawrence, it was chiefly masochism. Nicholson was not a man to expose the possible sources of his deviation. He neither He neither spoke nor wrote about his inmost thoughts. His lifelong intense attachment to his mother, to the exclusion of other women, is significant. An unfriendly, reticent man who did not court friendship, he kept his love for his family, among whom, as the respected elder brother, he was probably not given to intimate confidences. To others, he seemed cold and a man who repelled friendship. Lawrence, quite the reverse, uncovered the roots of his personal problems in floods of letters, in his writings, and in the confidences of a man who seemed impelled to seek friendship and understanding. In the books of Magnus Hirschfeld and Wilhelm Steckel, in the 914 large pages of Steckel's two volumes on sadism and masochism, for example, every conceivable deviation is illustrated by lengthy case histories. Scattered through these confessions are to be found many traits which were described by Lawrence himself and by his confidants and friends as being part of his emotional makeup. He was a perfect example of what Steckel called psychosexual infantilism, the perpetual adolescent. The narcissism and exhibitionism which often characterizes such people can be seen in the story of his life and perhaps prompted his frank disclosures of his inmost feelings. Both of these men are fine examples of the contribution which sublimation of sexual instincts made to our empire building activities. I suspect that Nicholson's fiery temper and cruelty would have destroyed his career if he had survived the mutiny, but T. Lawrence, by sublimating his personal love for individual Arabs in a crusade for their nation, did great things for them and became a living legend. It is interesting to speculate on what would have happened if Bruce and Lawrence had been caught while carrying out their periodic charade. Conduct to the prejudice of good order and military discipline was certainly going on, but I think that Lawrence's reputation and the awkwardness felt by many officers at having him serving in their units would have secured for them more lenient treatment than that given to the luckless Lieutenant General Sir Eyre Coote, the nephew of the famous Indian Army General Coote Bahadur. In November 1815, he was brought before the Lord Mayor of London on a charge of indecent conduct, having been caught in a boys' school with his breeches down, offering the boys money to birch him and to allow him to birch them. An outraged housekeeper refused to be bribed to let him go. The case was dismissed, but the Duke of York ordered an inquiry. By a board of 3 generals, they found that he was eccentric, not mad, and that his conduct had been unworthy of an officer and a gentleman. He was removed from his regiment, dismissed from the army, and degraded from the order of the Bath. This, commented his biographer in the Dictionary of National Biography, was severe punishment for a veteran officer whose brain had been affected by several wounds in service in tropical climates. Severe indeed, but it is hard to say how these generals should have dealt with their unfortunate brother officer. He had been noticed to be eccentric before, but as he was twice married and had a family, perhaps his sadomasochism was a misfortune unconnected with homosexual tendencies. Today, such a case would, in the often reported expression, be remanded for psychiatric reports. Many people today have good cause to be thankful that they did not live in the good old days when eccentric women were burned as witches and men whose eccentricity turned towards homosexual practices might also be burned or buried alive. And that's the end of chapter 7. Though it was interrupted by the goddamn camera conking out. So we got what? 164? Basically 11 pages to go. And I said I'm not going to read the appendix. And that's going to be all for now, bruv. That's all. 49, 50 minutes of that rubbish.